Welcome, everybody. My name is Laura Hamill, and I'm excited to talk with you today about the science of care. It's a pretty compelling and important topic, and what we're going to cover when we talk about the science of care is what does it really mean for an organization to care, and why does it matter? And even why is it sometimes taboo for us to even use the word care? We're also going to talk about the science behind organizational care. So you might be asking, if you know who Limeade is, why is Limeade talking about care? Well, our roots are in well-being, and we know caring about people as people is really core to being a great place to work. And we also know that through the research we've done around how do you really support well-being, that the way organizations support well-being can be the differentiator in terms of whether or not well-being really is authentic in an organization. So we have a deeply held belief that work can be better, and we believe that care is a fundamental part of that. So let me tell you a little bit about me. I'm Laura Hamill again. I'm the Chief Science Officer and Chief People Officer at Limeade. I have both of these roles for a reason. The Chief People Officer part is I head up our internal HR function, and then Chief Science Officer is heading up Limeade Institute. And Limeade Institute is an internal research function. We do primary and secondary research on the topics of well-being, employee engagement, organizational culture, and we really believe that if we're going around telling people the way you're supposed to do it, what the science says, that we better be doing that ourselves. So that's why I have both of those roles. We really believe in the integrity of, walking the talk. My background is I'm an organizational psychologist, so I'm very excited to be talking with you about this topic today. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the science of care, but this is also pretty personal for me. I've had my own experiences in this space. My own work experience about 13 years ago, I was working in a really large tech company. I really wasn't loving my job, even though it was a great job on paper. When I would drive to work every day, I really didn't want to go there. So I was really struggling with what to do with that. I also found out that I had 2 autoimmune diseases that had stress as a kind of a key component of it. My kids were now old enough, they weren't in car seats anymore or in baby carriers. They were old enough to start telling me the impact that I was having on them. And one day my son, who at the time was 6 years old, said to me, "Mom, why do you worry all the time?" And that just broke my heart. It made me really realize that I wasn't living, the life I wanted to live. I also couldn't have told you the last time I had fun or went out with some girlfriends. Really, truly, there was this kind of whole person kind of sets of issues that were coming to a head. And I really didn't feel like my organization cared. Even though I was considered a high performer, I had that label of being a senior woman that they were trying to retain. I didn't feel like I was getting anything back from them. And what was so sad about this is I remember when I first started that job thinking, I love this place. I'm never going to leave it. What a cool job I have. But 10 years later, I was so miserable that I decided to leave. So I think if that company had really done something and maybe really anything to show me that they cared about me, maybe I'd still be there. So I really encourage people to think about this for yourself. When was the last time you felt your company cared for you? Is it really easy for you to think about this? Is it something that just happened today, happened last week? Or do you have to go way back or even to a company that you don't even work in anymore? So that's what we're talking about, is that feeling of support, that feeling of care. So I'm really personally interested in this topic, but the science is even more interesting. So let's dig in. So what does care mean? You can start with this kind of simple definition. You can have it as a noun or a verb. What we really like to think about is the verb part of care. So think about the words that we tend to use in human resources. We use words like coach and include and engage and respect and teach and ask and listen and trust. These are all words that demonstrate that we care. So it's really what the work of HR is. So if these things, we're already doing these things in organizations, why can it feel so taboo to use the word care? Well, let's talk a little bit about this concept of care naysayers. So think about a care naysayer as somebody who really doesn't buy into this concept that it matters how we treat people or how people feel at work. So these are kind of some fun little ways of getting to that. So you're lucky to have a job. You know, in my day, we just came to work and we did our jobs. This is about business, not your feelings. Darn snowflakes. And probably my favorite, you get a paycheck. Every 2 weeks, I show you I care. So there are probably, I doubt maybe people who are even on this call are care naysayers, because you probably wouldn't even participate in this particular webinar. But you probably know somebody who's a care naysayer. Maybe somebody who's in your office right now. So why is it that we have such a reaction to this concept of care? It's really about the history of work and our assumptions about what work is supposed to be. Those are the reasons why it feels taboo to talk about care. So what are some of those assumptions? So we make assumptions about this concept of, we have contracts, an employee and an employer contract about work. And in some ways, this contract or this agreement we have is adversarial, almost to the point of we're trying to screw each other over. and we have this adversarial relationship. And so because you as an employee, you're trying to like get away with something, screw me over, I need to watch you really closely. I need to monitor you, and I need to be right there to be able to correct you when you make a mistake. Because we're all keeping score, right? And that's really all that matters. And, you know, if you do well, I'll show you how well you do. I'll show you how much I value you. I'll give you a 1% increase in your pay every year, right? So it almost sounds silly to say some of these things out loud, but these kinds of assumptions are built into how we've designed work. And the thing that's sad about that is that it's really based on a very old way of thinking about work. This was really when work was a lot more routine, and very much when we had more patriarchal models, some male-driven models. And I'm just, to be honest, that hasn't changed that much, but it's changed some. And we were a lot more about compliance, right? There were very specific ways the work had to be completed. We had to stay within the lines. We had to follow the rules. The following rules was really the most important thing. So I believe that work has changed. We have these old assumptions based on the way work used to be, but work has really changed. So why? Why now do we think that we should have different models of work? So first of all, the demands have changed. Work really requires a lot more creativity, innovation. In fact, we have whole new industries, of course, that we didn't have then, right? Like data science, AI, just all kinds of advances from a technology perspective. So work is really a lot more complicated, more complex. Our friends at Deloitte tell us that 80% of all companies rate their business as highly complex or complex for their employees. We also have different ways of working. We have outsourcing, independent contractors, gig workers, crowdsourcing. The work itself just really has shifted. You could, of course, can think about the way that the workforce, the people who are working have changed too. So almost 50% of the workforce will be millennial in 2020, which I have to remind myself, that's just next year, right? 2020 is not very far away. And what I think is fascinating, millennials tend to stay a shorter amount of time in organizations. So in another kind of survey that was done by Deloitte, 43% leave within the first 2 years, which I think is fascinating, right? Millennials tend to have a different way of thinking about, you know, how long should I be in an organization? Kind of cracks me up because I think about, in some reason in my head, I've always thought I should stay in each company I work in for 10 years. And so I do have these like 10-year kind of jumps in my career. But people who are older than me tend to just stay their whole career in one place, right? So we have very different perceptions of how long we should be working. And so we really have to be thoughtful about what that means with regard to retaining millennials. Yeah, I'm definitely not a millennial basher or really a big believer that millennials are that much different from everybody else. But I do think millennials tend to have just more courage and walk away from bad work more readily than people in my generation. They just don't put up with the stuff that my generation put up with. So there are real indications about attracting and retaining talent. And that's the kind of stuff you hear about probably in every HR conference you go to, every HR presentation, that the demands have really changed. But what else is different? Well, I like to believe, and I think the science supports, that our understanding of these topics around what attracts and retains employees has really evolved. We've gotten a lot smarter. We have a lot more science and evidence that well-being and inclusion and employee engagement, that culture, all those things matter, and we have a way to tackle them. We have a way to focus on them. We really have a burning platform and a solution and a way to solve some of the problems that we have. So to push it even further, I'd say that if we are still stuck in the traditional ways of thinking about work, if we still have those old assumptions about the way work has to be, we really aren't going to be able to solve for the workforce of tomorrow. So if your organization is stuck in the past in traditional ways of thinking about work, I really argue your business is not going to succeed. So in other words, the power has really shifted to be in the hands of employees. So if the power is in the hands of our employees, we really have to reprogram ourselves, right? We have to think differently about how we work with our employees. We have to be much more intentional and rethink the way work happens. We really have to be thinking about it from the perspective of the employee. So what is the employee experience? It's really about how does it feel to work here? Another stat from Deloitte, nearly 80% of executives rated employee experience very important or important, but only 22% reported that their companies were excellent at building a differentiated employee experience. So we think we know that we really need to be thinking about everything we do from the employee perspective, and think more about the concept of feeling and what employees feel about their work. But we just have a lot of work to do still. This is a little kind of summary of some recent work we did, a recent study with 200 HR leaders, and we asked them to describe how they think about the term employee experience, how they define the term employee experience. And this is just showing you a frequency of the words that were used. And you can see that the word that was used the most was the word feel. So employee experience has to do with what it feels like to work in an organization. You can see some other things that I think are interesting here, the concept of everything, which is a little overwhelming as an HR leader. You just think about the term everything and how that impacts the employee experience. And also, even by just having the word experience and having that kind of defining the word with its own word just shows how hard this is. There's a lot of organizations that are really struggling with understanding how to tackle the employee experience. And I think there's a hesitancy to just say it's about how people feel. I think we have, again, this is part of that taboo, that feelings and how people feel is something that we aren't accepting and acknowledging as really what this whole thing is about. I still will have people who will say to me, "Well, give me something really hard and objective. Like I don't want to just rely on employee attitudes or how they feel about things. Give me something that I can count." And it kind of drives me crazy, honestly. I'm like, you need to change your mindset. How people feel is the data. That is the hard data. It might not feel hard to you, but you have to rethink the way you're focusing on what matters at work. So I've been encouraged. I've been doing some interviews lately with CHROs, and I've been really encouraged by some of the things that I'm hearing. There was one particular CHRO that I interviewed in a really large organization, and she told me that she is refocusing all of her HR department efforts to really focus on how people feel as they go through the different programs that their HR organization is offering. So the example she gave me is the creation of a new internal hiring process. So she said I could solve for it being a really clearly understood process or a well-documented process, efficient process. She said I could solve for a process that ends up having more internal hires or one that's really fast. But she decided to solve for a process that focused on how people feel as they go through it. So even if you get the job or if you don't get the job, what she's trying to do is solve for you feeling valued, you feeling like you have information about, what it means to work there and that you still are an important part of this organization, even if you don't get this job. So the feeling part is what she's really focusing on. So I'm really encouraged to hear some of these leaders be really strategic about this concept of feeling. So some of you may be focused on some of these topics. And what I think is really interesting is that we almost always have these in different silos, right? So engagement sits in talent management, inclusion sits in diversity and inclusion. Culture might be who knows in what group, right? Because it's hard to define who even owns culture. Well-being sits in benefits, communications is internal comms. And really, if you think about all of these topics, what's underneath them is the employee experience. It really is. Every single one of those has to do with how employees feel. But sadly, we tend to cut those up, break those up, and have them be owned by different HR silos. So why do we care about the employee experience? One of the most important reasons why we care about the employee experience is because it's directly related to the customer experience. We all have customers, right? Internal customers, sometimes external customers. We all care deeply about maintaining really great relationships, retaining those customers. We have to have congruence between the employee experience and the customer experience. And I even go a further step to say it's not just that the employee experience impacts the customer experience, it's that they're one and the same. Your employees are also your customers, and they create the conditions for your customer experience. If you have any issues with retaining customers, if you have any issues with low levels of customer satisfaction, I would always say go back and find out from your employees how they're treated. Find out from your employees what the issues are there. I bet there's almost always a really explicit connection between the gaps with customer experience and the gap with employee experience. So if we care about this idea of employee experience, I would argue that the idea of caring for your employees is a fundamental aspect of the employee experience. So I often hear a lot of good intentions from C-suite level executives, that they talk a good talk and they absolutely say they care about their employees. But there's usually a big disconnect between what their intention is and what actually shows up for employees. So there's a lot of good reasons for that. They tend, have large organizations. There's maybe this lack of leadership visibility and being able to hear that voice from leaders. And a lot just really gets lost in translation. So you really have to take concerted efforts to show your employees that you care. It has to be active. It can't just be kind of there and presumed. So how do you do that? So this concept that I'm about to show you is saying there's a lot of different components to an organization showing that they care. So at the most basic level, you can show that you care by keeping your employees safe, showing them basic dignity and respect, also making sure that you're creating a trusting organization and providing meaningful work. There's the idea at the next level of valuing people as whole people, listening to them, helping them grow. And at the highest level, finding purpose and really connecting employees with their purpose, creating authentic cultures, and extending this idea outside of your organization. So we have a funny little term for this visual. We call it the care stairs. And, you know, there's a lot of work that we all have. I'm going to walk through this in a little bit more detail in just a minute. But what you'll see here, these are hard things. To show you care, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There are a lot of really difficult topics to dig into and take action on. One of the things I just like to tease about the care stairs is, oh, you know, where are things like the really cool juice bars that we offer now at our organization, or those ping pong tables that we all feel like we need to have, or Margarita Fridays, or even, you know, pet insurance doesn't fall into the care stairs. And it's so fascinating to me when I talk to HR organizations, and they tend to be focusing on things like that, things that are surface level, things that are, you know, you can buy and be done and check the box, things that really, honestly, don't make that big of a difference in showing your employees that you care. What I really want organizations to do is to dig into the hard stuff. Dig into the stuff that, you know, it takes time to create, that it really takes concerted effort. You can't just go buy all your employees some margaritas and have everything, have all the boxes checked. So let's dig in a little bit to some of these ideas. So this is the first level of the care stairs. So just to give you a feel, these aren't completely exhaustive, but just giving you a feel for what we're talking about. So on the most basic kind of first part of the care stairs, the idea of fair pay, offering health insurance, having benefits, having some standards for how people treat each other, right? That is not letting it be acceptable for people to be jerks to each other. On the kind of going across the columns, making sure that there's really high expectations for how managers and employees treat each other, and that we hold that bar, that we do what we say we were going to do, that we start to really trust our employees, give them autonomy to make some decisions. The last one has a lot to do with the work itself. So do we have enriching work? Are we creating the conditions for our employees to be engaged at work? Job design is one of those topics that I feel like we never talk about in HR, but it's probably a really fundamental idea that, gosh, the way we set up this work, the way we put these jobs together, the way that jobs connect with each other has so much to do with creating a great place to work. And it's just not a very sexy thing that we talk about in HR, but it really is a fundamental piece of showing employees that you care. The next level is this idea of treating people like whole people, having it so that people can be themselves at work, that we value diversity, that we hire people who have diverse backgrounds, that we really own up to our roles in creating stress, offer flexibility. Also that we have ways of listening, formal and informal ways of listening to our employees and then taking action on what we've heard, that we are recognizing our employees, that we're grateful for them, and that we help them grow, that there are real tangible ways that we help our employees grow, have fulfillment in their lives and in their careers. And then at the next, the kind of highest level of the care stairs are these concepts. So the concept of purpose, the concept of culture, and then the idea of how we extend this outside of our organizations. So purpose is such a key component of feeling like you have an amazing life and feeling like you're engaged in your work. You have to have this reason why kind of you get up every day. Remember when I was talking before about the idea of me not wanting to drive to work, right? I didn't feel that connection anymore. I didn't feel like my purpose was connecting to my work, and I just didn't want to do it anymore. So how can we help our employees connect their own personal purpose to the purpose of the organization? There's so many opportunities for us to show employees the difference they're making, the way they're impacting real human beings. And I think leaders play a huge role in that. Leaders can be inspiring, or they also can completely be cutting people down, breaking people down, and doing the opposite. So there's so much work around purpose. No, culture, creating a caring culture, you could kind of think about everything on the care stairs as contributing to culture. But the reason why I have it at the top level is because it's really hard to get to a place where all of these concepts hang together in an authentic way, where employees really start to believe that this is just how we do things here. It's not that we have a learning program or that we have some different ways that individual people in this organization show me that they care. It really has to do with the consistency, and it's so clear that it is the way we do things here to care about our employees and care about our customers. Finally, how we might extend that outside of the organization. So corporate social responsibility, philanthropy, all of those things really contribute to how we care outside of our organizations. What I think is interesting when we look at these care stairs are people, saying, oh, we do this. We have a corporate social responsibility group, and we do benefits, and we're working on fair pay. That there's like the first level, and then maybe a little bit of this at the top. But the stuff that's in between, that's where there's just real work to do. One other part of this is there's also all of the behavior in between. So it's the individual leaders, managers, and employees who show each other that they care, like through kindness, authenticity, listening, and encouragement. And I love that, and I think it is so important. But what I see a lot of organizations doing is they depend on that, right? They hope that managers are treating their employees well, and they kind of over-rely on the individual personalities of managers and leaders to make this happen. And what I would argue is we have to have both. You have to have individual human beings who are doing these kinds of things, who are listening and encouraging and kind, but we absolutely have to rethink how we support our employees, the programs, the processes, the initiatives that we take, and how those things show our employees that we care. Okay, well, some of you might be saying, really, Laura? I hope not, but some of you might be thinking that. And I just like to throw out an example to you. Think about the difference between a Starbucks that you go to when you're at home, like a Starbucks is its own kind of part of Starbucks, versus one that you might go to when you're at an airport. So the ones at the airport are not owned by Starbucks, and I really can tell the difference between the two of them. The ones in the airport tend to be messier. Their employees tend to be more stressed out. They look really unhappy to me compared to the ones that I go to when I'm at home. And the people at home, they know me, and they almost know my name. They acknowledge, I know you, I know who you are. And the store is beautifully clean, and they're kind, and they're thoughtful. And I wondered, just what's the difference? I was just in the airport the other day and experienced this firsthand. There was an employee who was working at the cash register, and she was so exhausted. She seemed so exhausted, she couldn't even make eye contact with me. She was looking down the whole time. She was so unhappy. The line was one of the longest lines I have ever seen. And so I could tell that she was just so stressed out. Well, while I was kind of halfway through the line, she decided to take a break, and everybody in the line groaned. I'm like, oh, we're never going to catch our flight. This line is so bad. And so I don't know if you've experienced something like that, but what's the difference? What's the difference between the Starbucks by my house and the Starbucks at the airport? There's just, I believe, a really marked difference in how those employees are treated by the companies that own them. The non-Starbucks stores, just so you know, also have lower profitability than those stores that Starbucks owns. So there's a real relationship between how the employees are feeling and the actual business results that they're achieving. So that's just a little example of how different it can be. The same products, the same, in theory, the same delivery mechanisms, but the people seem to be treated so much differently. Okay, so where are we here in this conversation? So we've talked about what care means. We've talked about why it matters and why it's kind of taboo. Let's dig in a little bit more into the science of care. So we've been talking about this topic at Limeade for a while now. So what we know is that when employees feel like they have higher well-being and they're supported by their organization, pretty amazing things happen. They also report high levels of favorability on recommending their company as a great place to work. They're less likely to leave. And also, we've found in prior research, when employees feel that their employer cares about them, they're just more engaged. So other companies have found similar kinds of results. So employees in a high trust culture who experience a caring workplace are 44% more likely to work for a company with above average revenue growth. So real connection there with revenue and growing your revenue and having a caring culture. Also, this is sort of the opposite view. When you have disengaged workers who don't feel valued, don't feel supported, they have more, they miss work more, they make more errors, they also have more accidents. So you can look at it kind of from the positive perspective and the impact on business, and then the negative for sure. So I always like to dig into some of the foundational theories underneath this concept of care. So there are absolutely different kind of academic theories on this. The need for security, which is the idea when we perceive that we have like a more emotional, safe environment, when we're free from harm, we're able to do better work. There's also the idea of attachment theory. When we have emotional connections with leaders and managers and other employees, that really leads to me feeling more connected to where I work. There's also the need for belonging. So if I work in a place where I'm valued and recognized and included, that there will be better outcomes. So all of these are important academic theories, but they tend to be a little bit more about individual styles and relationships, which of course matter. The academic theory that we think is the closest to what we're talking about is this idea of organizational support theory. So organizational support theory just does a better job at describing the role of the whole organization. So organizational support theory has these kind of components that's part of it. So does my company care about me and support me is kind of the underlying concept. So when I feel supported, not only does it fulfill my socio-emotional needs, like I feel a sense of approval, higher esteem, like I belong, but it also creates a positive emotional attachment. So I start to feel these positive feelings about the organization. And that really leads to the concept of mutual commitment. So what's really core, however, in this whole thing is that it's about the organization's intent. What I mean by that is that employees have to believe that there's a positive intent by the organization. So you can't fake this. It can't be surface level. It has to be authentic. The idea really is about mutual commitment. So I'm committed to you, employee, and employee is committed back to the organization. So it really is a virtuous cycle, a virtuous circle. So let's talk a little bit about what organizational support is. So this is where I get pretty geeky. I love this meta-analysis. So this meta-analysis is referenced here in the bottom actually has 558 studies that are included in this meta-analysis. So think about, usually we're talking about how many participants. This is 558 studies. So a meta-analysis is a study of studies. And for me, it's like striking gold. When you find a really good meta-analysis, I get super excited about it. So we can have even more confidence in what we learn from a meta-analysis because it is a study of studies. So what was found in this particular meta-analysis is that organizational support has to do with these constructs. So when you're trying to define organizational support, it has managers and coworkers, it has leaders, it has a perception of fairness. It also has to do with the idea of job security, but also flexibility and growth and feeling like your job is very enriching. So organizational support has these components. What it doesn't have is sort of the opposite, and probably no surprise when you read these, it's not about having an abusive supervisor or these psychological contract breaches, which is really the idea of, as an employee and employer, we have an agreement about what each of us is going to do. And a lot of times it's unwritten, but when we feel like what I said I was going to do and what you said you were going to do is broken, that breaks down trust in a really big way. So obviously that's not about organizational support. Politics, overload, conflict, Those things are sort of the opposite of organizational support. So if that's the idea of what organizational support is, it's like a construct. What about what is organizational support related to? So you could think about this as maybe the outcomes that come from having more organizational support. And there's so many good things here on this page. Trust, work-life balance, organizational citizenship behaviors, which is just this idea of doing things that you don't have to do, right? So maybe it's not on your job description to pick up a paper towel that's on the floor in the bathroom, but you do it just because you care. And so organizational citizenship behaviors shows up in such amazing ways. It's just this idea of going above and beyond. It's also related to higher levels of performance, more intention to stay. So there's a lot that's really positive that was found in this meta-analysis. What about the opposite? You know, the things that are lower when you have higher levels of organizational support. So again, think of these as sort of outcomes of organizational support. So it's negatively related to stress, burnout, work-family conflict, turnover. So think about this, when your organization is more supportive, it has an impact on your life outside of work. You have less conflict between work and home, which is really amazing. So those are some of the findings from that meta-analysis that I get so excited about. This is also some research that we've done here at Limeade. So what we were focusing on here is this idea of care. So we conducted our own research with a sample. This is over 350 people across different industries. They're not in our book of business, they're outside of our book of business, who are full-time, people who work full-time. What we found is that when people report that they care, they have higher levels of, that their organization cares, when they report that their organization does care about them, they report higher levels of well-being, engagement, and inclusion. And just the opposite, right? When your organization does not care, those three constructs are lower. So there was a statistically significant difference between the not care group and the does care group on these three ideas. So care, we found the idea of feeling cared for by your organization as really being related to higher levels of well-being, higher levels of engagement, and higher levels of inclusion. Sort of similar to what we were looking at before, we also found the opposite, the opposite idea to be true. So we found that care was related to lower levels of stress and lower levels of burnout. So when your organization doesn't care, only 14% said that stress was manageable. Only 16% disagreed that they were burned out. So we saw this kind of inverse relationship when people felt cared for. So there was lower levels of stress and lower levels of burnout. And just one more kind of view on this data. We looked at the idea of how care is related to intent to stay in the organization and likelihood to recommend the organization as a great place to work. And you can see it's even more marked than some of the other results. When you compare when I feel like my organization does not care to when my organization does care about me. So 7% said that they intend to stay 3 years or more when their organization does not care, compared to 60% when their organization does care. And I think the one that kind of blows my mind even more is the one that's in light blue. So if you report that your organization does not care, those participants, 9% favorable on recommending their company as a great place to work, it's 10 times higher, 91% when their organization does care. So hopefully you kind of get a little bit of a feel for some of the science behind the concept of caring. There's good academic research around organizational support and how organizational support is related to all kinds of outcomes we want in organizations and things we don't want. There's a negative relationship, but also this idea of care being related in some of the research we've done in Limeade Institute. So I always like to try to address the kind of glaring questions, because I have people say, well, I get it, Laura, I understand, there's some cool science here, but this is just hard, right? It's hard for us to show that we care, because I'm really worried that if I ask our managers to do this, like they're going to mess this up, right? That managers are going to make mistakes, and it just feels really like maybe it's too personal and we're going to blur the lines if we care about people as human beings. And it's just so much easier for my job as an HR person if I could just keep these things separate, right? Work is work, and people are people, and they're separate things. So I really hear people when they say that this is hard. So there is a risk if you feel like managers might mess this up, that we might blur the lines. Also that it takes an emotional toll, right? To care means you actually have to put some emotion into it. It's hard to have that kind of emotional toll. But I also would kind of throw out there that then you also don't get the upside, right? When things are going in a really positive way, you don't get the emotional upside as well. The last one I hear sometimes from people is, oh my gosh, we're going to have so many, if we ask our managers to care, if we ask employees to care about each other, we're going to have so many more lawsuits. Which is like, oh wow, that's interesting that you would think that. So what I decided to do is actually talk to an employment attorney I know and ask him his thoughts on that. Now this is so not a research study, right? It's an N of one, but he works with a wide array of different types of companies. And I asked him, tell me what you think from a pure employment law perspective. What do you think about the organizations that care for their employees versus the ones that maybe you feel like don't care? And how do you think about that from the perspective of your work, the employment law work that you do? And what he said is he really sees that when companies actually care about their employees, that sometimes there's more negotiation and it can take a little longer, but he sees those organizations as having fewer lawsuits and lower fines. He really feels like those organizations who don't care being much more litigious, paying out more. And also there's sort of a history when organizations are treating employees poorly, there's a bit of a history of things that you could point back to, of ways that employees haven't been treated well. There's like more of a leg to stand on. So he really was kind of emphasizing that caring has less risk than not caring. So I thought that was pretty fascinating perspective. So what's the risk of not caring for your employees? I would argue that it's a much bigger list, it's a much bigger kind of set of things to be worried about, and it has a lot to do with the success of your business. So the risks of not caring have to do with things like employees not feeling fully enabled, that they're not going to be committed, that they're not going to perform, and they're just going to leave your organization when you don't care about them. Maybe even a bigger impact than that is just this idea of culture risk. So it's a risk to your culture of having a reputation for being a bad place to work, for treating employees badly, for those costly lawsuits. So, and it's really hard to undo that, right? If you have an organization that's just known out there in the world as being a bad place to work, it's really hard to undo that. I also could argue that you might really miss out on all the positive sides of caregiving, right? There's so many benefits about caring for people. When you're the caregiver, there's a ton of benefits about caring for people. The caregiver, him or herself, experiences higher levels of engagement when you care, when you have altruism, when you have kind of a concept of something bigger than yourself that you're trying to do. It also can be really contagious when people care for each other. There's this really cool research by psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who has this term of the state of being in elevation. And that's kind of that warm feeling you get when you're inspired by somebody or when you care for somebody. It's almost like you kind of get a little bit of a chill. It's a real thing, and it feels positive. And when people see other people treating each other that way, in his research, it becomes contagious. It's kind of virtuous. It kind of creates a norm that this is how we treat each other. So there's real research behind this idea of, this caregiving feeling and it being contagious. And probably kind of maybe finally, the last point, when we don't care about people as people in our organizations, we're really creating what I would think of as like a chasm of meaning and purpose, an emptiness, a void. And I don't know about you, but I'm just kind of over that. I really don't want to be part of an organization that's soulless, that's creating that void. I want to be part of organizations that are creating more meaning and purpose. So my challenge to you, how about we stop focusing in human resources on creating efficient processes and streamlined processes, or a process that's really cool or millennial focused. Especially, let's not focus our efforts on making HR suck less. I literally hear people in HR leaders saying that's what they're trying to do, is make HR suck less. Let's have some higher aspirations for the work that we do, right? My challenge to you is, what if we could create an employee experience where every employee knows that your company cares about them? So a few takeaways. Really challenge those traditional assumptions about how work has to be. Every day we buy into, oh, we've always done it this way, we should keep doing it, it's just easier. Really encourage you to challenge those traditional assumptions. Your organization has so many ways to show that you care about your employees. Start digging into that. Start thinking about where your gaps are. What are you doing now? What are some other ways that you could really authentically show your employees that you care? And really think about this idea of creating an employee experience of care. Because what we know is when you do this, it's better for individual people and it's way better for your business. So I'd like to leave you with this, just this idea that, who's going to do this but us? Really, it takes people to just start creating the movement. And I hope you feel a little more inspired to keep working on creating an employee experience where your employees know that you care. So thank you. Thanks so much for your attention during this time. I know that was a bit of a long talk. And I think that if we have maybe a couple questions, I think you can put them in the chat. So we will see if we do.
Yes, one of the questions we always get is whether or not the slides will be available. So we will be sending out the recording and the deck after the presentation today. We also have some questions here. One is, what does support look like and who does what? So within an organization, and I guess, what are the roles there?
So the roles of support, that's an interesting question, because I think ultimately what you'd like to have happen is that everybody feels a sense of responsibility for care, right? That it becomes such a part of your culture that it's just the way you do things. So you would just see when you walk in the door, it's just the way people treat each other. Now, that takes time to make that happen. And that's why it was kind of at the highest level of the care stairs. It's because it's hard work and it takes a real commitment and some time to get to that place. What I would argue is it could start, maybe, I'd love to see a CEO start with it, but if that doesn't happen, I'd love to see a CHRO, a chief people officer, understand the value of authentically caring about employees and create HR strategies that align to that. So now, if that doesn't happen too, I think there are ways that we all could be thinking about the way we design our work and the way we create the sense of support and care through anything that we do, right? There's a way, if you were the person who is creating an employee survey, you could think about how you frame up the survey, how you say that the reason why we were doing this survey is not just to get a number or get a metric. We're doing this survey because we care about you and we're trying to make this place a better place to work. Really anything that we do, if you run a benefits organization, like sometimes I feel like we lose the point of why we're even doing benefits in the first place. It's because we care about our employees. It can feel like just a laundry list of a bunch of things that we don't even make very employee friendly in how we describe them. So there's so much opportunity for all of us to be thinking about the message we're sending, the way we're kind of in the design of whatever we're focusing on, actually supporting and caring for our employees. And so I just encourage you to do whatever your role is, try to think a little bit differently about how you do things, and just kind of test this. If you thought about it from an employee's perspective, would we be sending a message of support and care in the work that we're doing right now?
We do have some people asking if you can elaborate more on how leadership can embrace being authentic about care across the organization, and especially for mid-management, who are often in the middle, both managing up and down.
Yeah. So let me start with the leader part of it. I think what's pretty important is for leaders to make a connection between the success of the business and the people in the organization. What I see sometimes is we think of those as two different things. And that's what I really encourage leaders to do, is realize that the employee experience is the customer experience is the employee experience. And if we are not helping our employees see that they are core to the success of our business, and without them feeling supported, there's no way our business is going to be successful. So I just talk about the idea of like strategic alignment. We have to get leaders to connect the dots between what we're doing from a business strategy perspective and the role our employees play in that. And I just was reading something the other day of this amazing kind of way a COO was talking about how important it was for their employees to care about their patients. It was a hospital system, and it was beautiful. And it was talking about, we can play a role, such a strong role in changing these patients' lives. And I thought that was awesome. But what he missed in the whole thing was, and we care about you, employee. You're the reason and the way we're going to be able to be successful with our patients. We care about you in the same way we want you to care about your patients. So what I see is that there's a disconnect. We don't draw those lines. We don't make those lines as explicit as we need to. So that would be my recommendation for leaders is, first, read the research, understand the research that shows those connections, and then really talk with your employees about that explicit connection between them as employees and your customers. So for middle managers, I'd say there's a similar version, right? There's another version of that managers can be doing. They can create that line of sight between the work that their employees do every day and what the organization is ultimately trying to achieve. I think sometimes employees don't see that connection, that, oh, wow, when I have this particular part of the sales process that I own, and maybe they might kind of miss out of the impact they're having on human beings. So I always like managers to do that line of sight exercise where they help kind of show each individual employee how they're really connecting to what the organization is doing with its customers. So that would be, to me, a really important piece for middle managers to take on. Another really simple thing to do, and it makes a huge difference. I've heard lots of different organizations say it made a difference, is to just get their managers to ask their employees, how are you doing? And it sounds so basic and simple, but it's really an important kind of mind shift to have it be about the employee and how are you? How could I help you? How could I support you? What's going on with you? Versus what's the status of the project, right? And so having that shift be like, I'm here for you as a human being, even if it's, complicated, hard, blurring the lines kinds of stuff, I care about you. And I want to know what's going on for you.
We have quite a few people who love the care stairs. There are a couple of people wondering where the model came from. Is it from the Institute or is it from an org?
So the care stairs is from Limeade Institute. And you could think about it as kind of a culmination of lots of different perspectives and lots of different research studies. So the care stairs, maybe we could send this out to, we have a little worksheet, a little care stairs worksheet where you can kind of think through where is your organization against these particular components. And again, you think of it as sort of an aspirational model. I'd say all of us we focus on this like crazy here, and we definitely can't check every single box or every single stair. There's a lot to continue to do, but I think if we have aspirations of being more, right, of thinking bigger, that it helps us get there faster. So that we can probably share out.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think this is our last question here. Have you done any validation research or found any validation research to help determine if this is part of the outcome or if care is the outcome, or if it's part of a well-functioning organization alongside engagement, inclusion, et cetera?
I love that question. Yes. I love that question because you're exactly right. What I probably would say, it's probably a driver and it's probably an outcome. And so we have just kind of started, we've been doing a lot of research over time around organizational support. And so that model, we've done some interesting research on just making sure that the model that we've created, it's got 8 different components, that all parts of that model actually are related to overall perceptions of being supported, they're related to well-being. But the concept of care is one we've just started to dig into and doing research around that term, using that word care. And I think you're probably right that there are times where it could be independent variable or driver, or it could also be an outcome. And so really digging into it and understanding it more is one of the things I'm excited for our work in Limeade Institute.
Yeah. Okay, I lied to you. There's one more question. And this one is, how do you recommend, if at all, tying performance management goals to care metrics?
Oh, that's a good question. So I would probably argue that performance management, that's a whole other webinar, is to talk about that, because I've really come to think differently about performance management and what the point of performance management is. I think, again, in sort of going back to those traditional assumptions, I think we have overemphasized the focus on, individuals and not focused enough on the systems individuals are in from a performance management perspective. We focus more on writing SMART goals and less on how do we actually help people achieve those goals. So it's sort of like all those kind of traditional HR things where we've overemphasized some pieces and really underemphasized others. So I would say I think pretty differently about performance management and what that even looks like. And I think there's a way to do it that's absolutely about care. It has a lot to do with growth. It has a lot to do with giving people a sense of progress. I think progress is so important, but it has not very much to do with stack ranking, with putting people in categories and boxes, and thinking about it in kind of the old traditional way.
So that is all the questions that I'm seeing here. Yeah, but thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today. I think the presentation has been great. We're getting a lot of great feedback. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on the webinar today. We will be sending out the recording as well as the presentation slides, and I see a lot of requests for the care stairs as well. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks so much, everybody.